You're listening to an archived Cabral Concept podcast. After listening to this show, check out the most up-to-date podcasts available at stephencabral.com/podcasts or search directly on iTunes. And now, welcome to the Cabral Concept, where board-certified naturopath and integrative health practitioner Dr. Stephen Cabral shares how he was diagnosed at the age of 17 with a life-altering illness and given no hope for recovery. It was only after studying and traveling all over the world did he discover how to combine ancient Ayurvedic healing practices with state-of-the-art naturopathic and functional medicine to fully rebalance the body and re-energize it with life. It's time to discover how to get well, lose weight, and finally feel alive again. And now, here's your host, Dr. Stephen Cabral.
Dr. Belisa Vranich, who's a clinical psychologist and the director of breathing science at the Ash Center in New York City, the founder of the breathing class and the author of Breathe. An amazing guest, and we're going to dive into a topic that most people would never even give a second thought to. But as we begin to get into the show, you can start to understand how the way in which we breathe and the amount of oxygen that we take in actually affects our mental and physical health. So Dr. Belisa is an expert in this, literally goes all around the world teaching proper breathing technique. Now, it's something that each one of us knows innately as we're born, as a child, and we start to lose it, though. The more sitting that we do, the weaker our core muscles get, the more anxious or stressed that we get, and we start to change our breathing patterns. I'm not going to give it all away today. This was a great conversation. Actually, we could have talked for easily 2 hours. I do like to keep my interviews somewhere around the 45-minute mark to be respectful of your time, of course. But I'm so happy that I was able to have her on. Her travel schedule, her teaching schedule is super busy. So we're all lucky to have her. Stay tuned for this show. Hopefully you enjoy it. Of course, let both of us know how it went, how you enjoyed it on Instagram at Stephen Cabral. Check it out. Enjoy the show. Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the Cabral Concept. I'm Stephen Cabral, board-certified naturopathic doctor. Excited you could join me here today on this very special edition of the Cabral Concept. I have Dr. Belisa Vranich on the call today. Welcome to the podcast, Dr. Belisa.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Very excited to have you on the show. Since I usually don't do justice my guests that I do have on the show, I would love you to be able to introduce yourself, tell us a little bit more about what you do, and essentially how you got into this amazing work that you're about to share with us today.
Okay, well, I'm a clinical psychologist by trade. So my background is actually as a child psychologist. And once I went through, I don't know how many jobs related to psychology, I came upon breathing. And I know that sounds funny, but what I was looking at was the psychology of breathing. So I started something, I founded something called the Breathing Class, and then wrote a book called Breathe, the Simple Revolutionary 14-Day Program to Improve Your Mental and Physical Health. And that leads me pretty much to here, is I now don't do as much therapy anymore. Actually, I don't do therapy at all. I actually really focus on people's breathing, the mechanics of how they breathe, the psychology of how they breathe, and help them get better from there.
Yeah, I think that's amazing. I was actually introduced to your work, I believe, through a mutual friend, Jason Ferrugia. And
yes.
He was telling me about your work with, I believe, the SWAT team and some really high-level communities that you would never in a million years think like, oh, these people are going to get into natural health or something called breathing or specific breathing-based technique, which I want to go into today. And the reason I want to talk about this is that it can carry over everything from stress-based situations, overall health, anxiety, depression, waking up with energy or not waking up with energy, and then also improving athletic performance. So this is something that's just so overlooked that we don't talk about enough that we have to get into. But tell me, was SWAT one of the people that did contact you?
Yes, and it was SWAT and jiu-jitsu fighters and military and law enforcement. And I was surprised, but I was really happy about it because it was a community that I'm comfortable with. My dad was Army. I have a short fight background. My brother does as well. So it was a community that I was surprised was calling me. But then when you look at their need for controlling their nervous system and having endurance, it makes perfect sense.
Without a doubt. And actually, that is the time when you don't want to panic, right? And as we're going to be getting into today, so if I ever find myself in a stressful situation, I've taught myself to immediately go back to being aware of my breathing. And essentially I don't know who originally taught it to me, but when I started to do a lot of speaking from stage in front of hundreds of people and then maybe 1,000 plus people, there's going to be a little bit of nerves, right? It's excitement, it's nerves, whatever. A lot of people might start to panic. But usually in those situations, those people are holding their breath. They're tensing up their nervous system. If you're tense, well, that's going to show in everything that you do. You're going to be, as a fighter, you wouldn't be able to move as fluidly. You wouldn't be able to move as quickly. And if you're on SWAT, well, then your thinking's going to be clouded. And that split second could be the difference between your life or someone else's by making the wrong decision. So I can totally see why those specific groups contacted you. What I want to do right now, though, is let's talk about some of the symptoms that people may not even know that they have of breathing improperly.
So the two I see most often, I'll tell you all of them, but the two that I see most often are digestive disorders and back pain. And then on top of that, usually there's a disruption of energy, so fatigue, a problem with sleeplessness, and also people who would like to meditate can't get into a meditative state. But the two I see probably every single day, if not both of them together, are the digestive problems and the lower back pain.
Now, tell me, since we do so much work with digestive-based issues in my practice, what is it about the digestive system that's essentially triggered to become dysfunctional if someone's breathing is improper? And again, in a minute, we'll talk about what is proper breathing in order, obviously, to correct these things.
So with digestion, usually it's that the person comes in and they're talking about acid reflux, GERD, or even rumination. And if you think about, again, I always go back to the psychology and the anatomy, is that if you have been bracing your body because it's a way to sort of prepare yourself or deal with stress, it also means that your diaphragms, the movement of your diaphragm has been constricted. And your diaphragm, if you think about your esophagus, your diaphragm is sort of a secondary esophagus. So if it's not moving, the expansion and contraction of the diaphragm that you need to be able to support peristalsis and keep your digestive organs happy is not happening. So teaching people to breathe diaphragmatically means that their esophagus and their digestive system is just going to be happier just because mechanically things are doing what they should be doing.
Absolutely. And that makes total sense. So you bringing it back to like the lower esophageal sphincter at the bottom of that esophagus and acid reflux and GERD, because I'm going and thinking right now as you're saying that, this makes complete sense because in my practice, when we work with people with achalasia, which is basically the inability to really move the food down the esophagus and get it into the stomach, so they're choking quite a bit of the time, that the way that we're able to help them from a functional medicine standpoint, not necessarily a biomechanical standpoint, which again, we'll talk about that in a moment, but is to do things to actually calm the sympathetic nervous system, which would be using a product such as Adrenal Soothe that contains ingredients that have ashwagandha and phosphatidylserine that help to calm cortisol. But really, we have something in our own body that can allow us to calm cortisol and norepinephrine and adrenaline, and that's being able to get into belly breathing or diaphragmatic breathing. I think it's probably something you prefer more of a term of, and the ability to begin to slow down the autonomic nervous system and calm both our body and our brain. And I think one of the reasons why it's going to be so great for you to teach us this is that our physiology also affects our psychology. So if our body is tense, our mind can be anxious or overwhelmed, and vice versa. If our brain is tense, it can make our body tense and really hurt our ability to get in the oxygen and the breath that we need. Would you mind doing us a favor? Because this is one thing that I loved is when I was watching one of your videos when you spoke for the TED Talks, is you asked people how they're breathing right now. And I would love for you just to take people through that for 1 minute. Just ask them, get them to think about how they're breathing and get connected with their body so that we can teach them then how to breathe correctly in a moment.
Oh, that's perfect. So what I want you to do is what your audience to do, and you as well, even though I'm sure your breathing is very good, is that I want you to take a deep breath. And that deep breath, like you hear everyone say, oh, just take a deep breath. So it's that dramatic breath where you usually puff up the top of your body. So most people, when they are told, take a deep breath, will inhale, look up slightly, and puff up the top of their bodies. Sometimes the shoulders will even go up, but it's a very vertical type of feeling, like you're lifting up towards the sky, as if somehow up there was more air. And on the exhale, you kind of settle down, and I'll say in quotes, let it go, let the tension go. You exhale, you sort of soften your whole body. So that is the way most people are breathing when they're told to take a deep breath. And unfortunately, that is nothing. That is not anywhere near what a deep breath should look like. So the way you should be breathing, and I always say to look at your children under the age of 5.5 exactly, or your family pet, and I guess that case would be Moose. Is that right?
That's my boy Moose. That's right.
That's your boy Moose. So take a look at your pets or your children under the age of 5.5 and take a look at how they breathe. They will expand in the middle and contract in the middle. And that's actually the way you should be breathing, biomechanically, anatomically sound, is you inhale and your whole body expands, and then your whole body contracts. And your auxiliary muscles, which are your neck and your shoulders, actually should not move. So that's the inhale that I want. So if you actually want to do this right now and switch your breathing over, it sounds simple, but it's actually going to be probably the biggest change you can make to your health today, is that if you're sitting down, and probably you are, because most of us spend way too much time sitting, is that you're going to relax your legs and get a little bit more space between your knees so that when you inhale, you can inhale forwards. Now, this is a beginner breath. This is not the way I want you to breathe all the time, but most of us are so braced and so tensed up in the middle that the belly breath helps you start to get into the mindset of how you should be breathing. So what I want you to do is I want you to tip at the hips. So tipping at the hips, and again, a lot of folks who don't tip at the hips and have rigid thoracic cavities and rigid hips, this is a little bit difficult. They'll go to their shoulders, but keep your shoulders relaxed. Tip at your hips. So if you squat, you'll know this hip position is one that you do when you squat, where you sort of bump your butt back. It's also, when I'm speaking to someone who takes selfies, it's selfie butt position. So it is a tilt where your butt is behind you and you're letting your belly go, sort of a very Santa Claus type of look. So on the inhale, I want you to come forward, tip at the hips, let your belly go, and inhale at the same time. And when you exhale, I want you to lean back, tip your hips underneath you as if you had a tail, you were putting your tail underneath your body. And on the exhale, I want you to squeeze your belly button towards your spine. And I want you to continue breathing this way, where you inhale, relax your body, and exhale and lean back and think belly button to spine. Now, as you continue breathing this way, take your shoulders, put your hands on your shoulders, and just make sure your neck and your shoulders are soft, that they're just not part of this process. And they shouldn't be part of this process because your lungs, the biggest part of your lungs, are actually way down between your nipples and your belly button. So if you put your hands in the very middle of your body, that's where the biggest part of the lungs are. So as you tip forwards and relax your body and expand, exhale, you lean back and squeeze. This is a beginner breath, and it's the very core of what I teach. So you might feel like you get a little bit lightheaded, and it's because it is a much, much bigger breath than that breath that you take with your shoulders and with the top of your chest.
That's great. That is exactly, I think, the best way to get started with that. And you explained, we talk about it sometimes as the hips looking like a bucket, a bucket of water. Mm-hmm. And as you start to dump it forward, you feel the water dump out. That's the anterior pelvic tilt. And as you pull back, the water tips back out the backside. That would be the posterior pelvic tilt that you were explaining. And I think one of the things is, and I know that this was true for me, is when I first started to do this type of breathing and was learning it, is that I would actually get a little lightheaded. So I was glad that I was doing it seated, but also my abdominal area got a workout. And I mean, it really taught me to, it's called like the vacuum, maneuver as you draw in, because one part that you were explaining, you get a massive amount of oxygen into the body. And so we get it all the way down to the lower lobes of the lungs, where a lot of those toxins sit there. And I've talked about that before. And if you're collecting toxins, you're collecting a lot of carbon. you're not going to be able to fully expel that. So, we talk about 4 main ways to get toxins out of the body: through the stool, through the urine, through the sweat, but you can also get it out through your lungs as well if you're getting all of that oxygen out. So sometimes I think we teach people, not necessarily yourself as an expert, but maybe as like a lot of us personal trainers or naturopathic doctors, the big breath in, but we don't focus on then expelling all of the oxygen out of the lungs, like fully clearing them. And I think the maneuver you taught about pulling in and basically creating that vacuum, that will actually give your abs a pretty good workout.
It'll give your abs a great workout, and it'll also strengthen your obliques because your obliques are doing a lot of work, and move your lower back in a way you may not be used to, which is actually good for it. And I love that you bring up toxins, because the one way that we very efficiently get lymph out of the body, lymph as a waste product, is by using the diaphragm to breathe. So if you think about lymph as being waste product that's in, at the very surface of your body that needs to get cleared out, one of the reasons that we may be more toxic, more inflamed, having acidity that's disrupted is because we're not flushing that toxin out of the body, and because we're not really exhaling well. So the amount of residual air you have in your body, because your exhale is not a good, thorough exhale that's done with the muscles and in the way that should be happening, you're walking around toxic, and you're walking around with, as you said, too much CO2 or an unbalance of oxygen and CO2.
That's great. And I love that you brought up acidity as well, because we have so many people, for the last 30 years or so trying to be on a more alkaline-based diet and even longer. And although I promote an alkaline diet because of the amount of produce, fruits and vegetables that you're getting in, one way, and actually the best way, and I don't think I've ever spoken about this on 920 plus Cabral concepts, is that probably the best way to create alkalinity in the body is to actually get more oxygen in as well. And that oxygen is actually going to create more of an alkaline-based environment that you could ever hope to get through the food-based. And so it's one way to look at it. If you're trying to create a more alkaline-based environment, you're trying to balance that pH of the blood. And again, a lot of people will always come back and say, well, your blood always maintains the same pH, so it doesn't matter what you eat or how you breathe. And I always go back and I have to qualify that and say, yes, you're right, that's true, but to the rest of your body's detriment. And it's because your blood will always maintain the blood pH that it needs between about a 7.3 and a 7.5, but you have to always have a way to do that. And so oxygen and low breathing is going to allow you to do that to such a greater degree. And then eat the alkaline-based diet on top of that.
That's a perfect description, and I may just have to steal it from you because that was so beautifully summarized, which is that how acidic your body is going to be affected not only by what you eat, so you're metabolically, but also by your respiration. And it's something that we're looking at right now and actually collecting data. What we're seeing, and we meaning my students and the statistician, is that you can actually change the acidity of your body by changing your breathing. So the alkaline diet, very important, that you're taking the right supplements, that you're eating the right food is fantastic. But there comes a time where you may be doing all that and you still may be acidic. I can tell you that you are someone who is probably completely out of balance with your breathing in that vertical way, not using your diaphragm, and your body is just completely out of balance of your breath. So that was just beautifully said, is that you can change the acidity of your body, and then your adrenal glands won't have to work so hard. And this is where you are the expert, not I, as far as what happens when your body does try to keep the pH of your blood neutral, is that the rest of your body has to work really, really hard, and sometimes way harder than it should be, to keep that acidity neutral, and you suffer because of it.
And one thing that I wanted to ask you, and following up with this, because I know that, you are a clinician, you're also in the lab and you're kind of looking at all these studies and research, is have you studied how the breathing changes when someone's sleeping? Because I'm colleagues with a very well-known pulmonologist, and he does a lot of research in this field. And what they show is that a lot of people, and I know this is off topic, but I think it's important for a lot of people out there with sleep apnea and just in general, if you're not waking up refreshed, there's a lot of people when they lie horizontal, they actually get in less oxygen. Sometimes it is actually from being a little overweight and having more pressure on the chest, working with gravity in a different way. You're lying horizontal. But also some people start to breathe more shallowly, or they don't breathe through their nose anymore. So I want to talk about nasal breathing, but I would also like to see, have you seen that in the lab, or I think I'm trying to say more from a research-based perspective, of things changing for 8 hours a night when you're lying in bed?
If you're sleeping 8 hours a night, because most of us, are trying to get those 8 hours in. But what's interesting is that you might have someone who's breathing in a very dysfunctional way during the day, and when they lie down horizontally, their breathing actually gets more anatomically congruous. So they'll actually start breathing diaphragmatically because they're in a horizontal position. So a combination of things happens. Number one is that you breathe less in that prone or supine position just because of gravity. However, your style of breathing is probably a little bit better. And it's just because the mechanics, if you're in bed or lying down, it's harder to breathe in a dysfunctional way. So I know that there was a great study that came out last year, which looked at mice with clean brains. And it had to do with the fact that when you breathe, if you're breathing better, your diaphragm is moving better and you're able to clean out your system better. That's an incredibly simplified version of this mouse study. But people, when they sleep, especially if they're a little bit overweight, are going to snore. And snoring, again, is obstruction. It's not just snoring. We really have to start rethinking what snoring is in a very serious way, is that there's obstruction of air either coming into your body or out of your body. And there are things you can do for it, which can help immediately, including losing weight, sleeping on your side, using a CPAP, and making sure that you're during the day life, that you have as little stress as possible, that your pH is as neutral as possible, because it actually does affect your nighttime sleep.
Yeah, without a doubt. We just see people dramatically lower inflammation within 21 days, and a lot of those sleep apnea or choking or snoring goes away. And that's because when you're inflamed, you start to close off a lot of those passages. And that gets exacerbated when you are lying on your back and you are working with gravity. But I'm assuming that you do not recommend people sleep on their stomach, because that will...
No.
Yeah, it will hurt, right?
Yeah, and I recommend side breathing. It's most of the time as a psychologist, although I talk a lot about breathing at night because it's something that not only for your health, but for your relationship. And, folks will giggle, but it really can hurt your relationship if you snore to the point that your significant other, your bedfellow, is being kept up as well. But you're waking up and you're tired and you're grumpy. And it tends to affect your appetite as well. If you're tired and grumpy, you're probably going to have more of an appetite. So if you're trying to diet, it's not helping you at all. But more so, I'm going to look at when you're awake and you have control over your breathing. What are you doing with it? How are you distorting it? What are the myths that you're following that makes you think that your deep breath is really a deep breath, it's calming you down, when it's actually doing quite the opposite?
Yeah, I agree. And I would agree side sleeping is the best way to be, especially since most mattresses today are not set up for any other type of sleep position besides like a fetal-based side position. They're too soft, they're too hard, it's just not, it doesn't work with the normal curvature of the spine. So what I would like to go from here is, why should we be breathing through our nose? Because there are a lot of people who say, well, I can get as much oxygen in through my mouth, if not maybe more. Have you seen a relationship between blood pH and breathing through the nose versus the mouth? And what does that do for the athletes and SWAT and everyone else that you've trained? Of course, your everyday person as well.
So with nose breathing or nasal breathing, what's interesting, if you break it down into super practical language, is that you're breathing through an opening that's smaller than your mouth. So a lot of people will go to mouth breathing just out of laziness. Maybe they have a deviated septum, maybe they have allergies, and they'll resort to mouth breathing, which is bad for so many reasons. It's a completely different podcast. But I look at the psychology as, why have you gone from a nose breath, a nasal breathing, to a mouth breath? And a lot of it has to do with either a situation that's going on with your nose or your breathing, or with just the laziness of pulling in a breath through your nose is harder than doing it through your mouth. So if you get into that habit, and if you have forward head posture where opening your mouth and leaning forward is something that's actually, unfortunately, easier than having a straight posture and breathing through your nose, you're going to breathe through your mouth. It's getting more air into your body simply because it's a bigger opening. So our laziness in our attempt to cut corners is really hurting us, because when you're breathing through your mouth, you're getting all the schmutz from the air around you, which probably is not the best. And you're missing a lot of the great things that happen when you breathe through your nose, including that it's a more calming breath. It's a cleaner breath. It gets to go in through your body, supposedly also cool your brain and slow the breath down. So nasal breathing, changing to nasal breathing, making sure your kids are not breathing through their mouth during the day or even at night is very, very important. As an athlete, what happens when you start breathing through your nose is that you're adding pressure to the breath. So it's harder to breathe in through your nose. And my go-to expert for nasal breathing is Brian McKenzie, because he can explain it and uses is the nasal breathing person. But when I work with athletes and I work at looking at all their muscles and their posture and their mindset as far as breathing, the breathing through your nose is going to make it more difficult to breathe. So it's sort of like adding a barbell or adding weight to something that you're doing. And most of us will resort to that biomechanically unsound vertical breath when we have to breathe harder. So what I find is that if you don't correct people and have them use their diaphragms and then breathe through the nose, is that you're going to end up taxing your auxiliary muscles. So because breathing through the nose is harder, you will go up to that vertical breath rather than stay in a lower body breath. So what I'm suggesting is that if you're trying to calm yourself down or just be a better breather and just clean out the air better and keep yourself in a parasympathetic state, is when you go to do that abdominothoracic breath, that lower body breath where you're using your diaphragm, stay with your nose and watch how it's different than breathing through your mouth. So I'd like to add a component of psychology into all of this, is breathe through your mouth and realize, yes, this is why I breathe through my mouth. It's easier. Then switch to your nose and know, this is a better way to breathe, even though it's harder, and I'm going to consciously do it more frequently because it's better for me.
I'd agree, and I'd say it's only harder in the beginning. So I like the barbell analogy or the weight analogy. The very first time, you put, let's say, your body weight on your back to do a squat, it'd be very, very challenging, right? Working up to that point. But then the thing with nasal breathing is you don't necessarily have to take it further than that. So it will become very easy to maintain in the future. And for those people out there, so I have a deviated septum on my right side, very, very difficult, very, very small nasal passage. And so for me, when I was really called attention to that, when I was over in India, and we did something called Jalaneti, which I'll save everybody the graphic nature of that, of using basically a little tube to floss your nose. I don't even want to get more into it than that, but couldn't get that tube through. And it's because that nasal passage is so small. And I was a mouth breather until just about maybe 6 or 7 years ago, because it was a lot more difficult. So one, I hadn't fully cut dairy out of my diet. And for me, not for everyone, but for me, it was a huge trigger for nasal passage swelling. So if one other person it helps, then great, that will help. Because again, I was only using clean dairy. I was using grass-fed whey protein, and I wasn't doing it too often. I was doing one a day. But for me, it just didn't work with me. I cut that out, a few other things that I found on my food sensitivity test, and all of a sudden I could breathe again. It was amazing. But then I had to retrain my system to be able to breathe through my nose. One thing I found was this, is that I needed to take at least half the breaths when I was nasal breathing versus breathing through my mouth. And the reason is, it's really challenging to be a good belly breather if you breathe through your mouth, because you lift up your chest almost like you're gasping for air, because you are. The human body, I don't believe, is meant in an emergency. When you need to get more oxygen, you'll open both your nose and your mouth. That makes sense. But normal everyday breathing, if we're looking to calm that sympathetic nervous system, just like you stated before, which means we stay relaxed, we stay calm, we let all of the positive hormones such as the DHEA and progesterone and testosterone rise and not cortisol, right? We don't want our cortisol to start to pump up. Well, if you switch over to a mouth breath, I don't have the research behind this, but I would like to see this one day proved out. I'm assuming that you're going to see higher levels of cortisol or at least adrenaline, thinking that your body might be more of a flight or flight-based state where you're breathing more to an upper chest or thoracic-based breath. And I would just like to hear your take on that.
Sure. And that's why I cue the hips, is that you have people that you can teach the diaphragmatic breath to, but they'll continue to use the cues of their shoulders for the breath. And it's true that if you're taking a monstrous breath or you're out of breath and you're trying to catch up, nose, mouth, any which way you can, getting air in and out of your body is the right way, especially if it's an emergency, especially if you're not hyperventilating. But the tip of your hips, which then engages your pelvic floor, which, as you know, is connected to your diaphragm, keeps you in a lower body breath. So once people understand their diaphragm and understand how it affects digestion, how it affects the back, how it's connected to the pelvic floor, and how the psoas muscles connect the two, it only makes sense to be breathing through the lower part of your body and then your neck and shoulders if you happen to need that little bit more, but definitely not as a primary breath. So that's where the psychology and that's where the understanding kicks in. And you know this with your patients, is that you can tell them this is good for you, but unless they are personally committed and really understand the process, they won't do it. So understanding the way the diaphragm works and understanding how everything is connected from the diaphragm to the lower part of the body, to the hips, to the pelvis, is terrifically important to change the body back to where it used to be. And again, it's not a new breath. So I always have people ask, well, how long does it take to learn this? And I remind them, you're not really learning something new. You're just really reminding your body of how you used to breathe before you started bracing and started this really bad habit of using your shoulders. So I bring in the nasal breathing afterwards, but it's only after the person has learned sort of the mechanical part of breathing with their diaphragm and then adding nasal to it, or else it's too many things at the same time. But the perfect breath, like you just said, is a breath. It's a lower body breath. It's a diaphragmatic breath where you expand and you're breathing at least in through your nose, if not in and out, because it keeps the breath slow.
That's great. And I think there are levels to this. I mean, the first level, like you spoke about right there, is making sure that you're not breathing through the upper chest, that you are getting into the lower lobes of the lungs for overall both mental and physical health, because there's both aspects to that. And then also then what people do in maybe a sports or combat situation is very different than what do we do 99% of our day. And so that's when I think you have the time to then try to perfect it, which means breathing in through the nasal passages. I like to teach that as well. And one of the reasons is that your body's perfectly set up. Like, we just look at them as turbines that spin the air in through the nose, and that also you have a mucosa, and the mucosa is there to also catch any virus and pathogens that may be coming in, perfectly set up for that. So, when we're looking at that perfect breath, I would like you to try to take us through that for, what would a minute of perfect breathing look like that we can practice right now and that people can then take on their own as well, because we need that demonstration. On today's show notes, I will link up an image of the diaphragm, which I think is important to look at, because when you look at trying to expand a balloon, or you go wide instead of tall, you want to look at that image. You want to have that visual. And then what I'd like to say is, like, how can we do 1 minute of perfect breathing? You're welcome to teach whatever you would like from the perspective. I usually just give people a simple count of somewhere between 3 seconds or 5 seconds in, and then 5 seconds to 7 seconds out, meaning a longer breath out than in. But that doesn't mean this is a perspective that I've been taught. I would love to hear your perspective, though, as the expert on this topic.
Sure. And I think that I'd want to start with the idea that, we love this whole notion of mind-body connection, that we can control our arousal. And there's so much amazing talk going on now about the vagus nerve and sympathetic nervous system, parasympathetic nervous system. But I'd like to go back to basics and really practical stuff, which is that the way you breathe, your range of motion, and the location of your motion, the LOM and the ROM, is the knob that controls your arousal. So if you think about the knob that controls your air conditioner or the speed of your windshield wipers, is that you can actually change your arousal by changing that knob, by moving that knob. And the knob is your breathing. So what you think is important and your mantra and whatever you say to yourself is important, the pattern of your breathing is important, but the overarching concept that we really have to own, because it's ours, we deserve to own it, is that the way you breathe, whether you're breathing a lower body breath, whether you're using your diaphragm, is actually what unites the mind and the body. And it's what puts us in whatever arousal state we want to be in. And too often, people will talk about their state of arousal. And by arousal, I mean anxiety, stress, boredom, lack of energy. Just the whole extreme is that we have so little vocabulary for that. And we so feel like it's something that's inflicted on us that we don't realize that we have almost absolute control over it. So the first thing I would do with the breath and teaching people breathing to calm yourself down is to get a better vocabulary. And this is where the psychology comes in, is that usually we're either exhausted or we are amped. So start by thinking of all the different variations between exhausted and amped. And are you amped excited, or are you running on cortisol, adrenaline, maybe caffeine? So really start thinking about, from exhausted, you probably have 10 different words that you could say on a spectrum that go all the way up to really jazzed and excited. And start attaching the breath, the way you breathe, to each of those, and you'll realize how much more control you have over how awake or how sleepy you are, if you want to be awake or if you want to be sleepy. So I know that's an incredibly long description, but again, the breathing, the way you breathe, is your mind-body connection. It's not something that's out there somewhere. It's not so much what you're saying to yourself in your brain. It's really about, where are you breathing from? How wide is your inhale and how narrow is your exhale?
Where you're saying from the foundation basically is trying to tie the two together. So, because there really are two sides to this, that someone is exhausted or they're driving on anxious energy, they're amped, like you just said. And both of them can actually require two different types of breathing, right? So one is to get yourself, like a fighter, into a state for absolute energy and preparedness. And the other one is to calm down the body. I think what I see in the basically everyday life are people going from one stressor to another. And so if I were to err on one side, it would actually be on the side of always going back to calming the body. Since most people don't get the 8 hours of sleep at night, or if they do, they're just shutting down maybe 1 hour before bed. And then they're waking up and they're immediately starting their day with emails or getting the kids ready for school or whatever it might be. So maybe they have an 8 hour to 9 hour parasympathetic based time. That's saying that they actually sleep through the night. They don't wake up during the night with a state of low blood sugar or high cortisol or estrogen dominance, whatever it might be. But they're really looking at somewhere around 15 or 16 hours of the day, of the 24 hours, of more sympathetic. So what I look towards is more of that calming based breath. And for me, at least, it's going, just like you said, and making sure that I'm not carrying the tension in my jaw or my neck or my shoulders, and that I'm actually feeling more weighted down towards the ground, that I'm feeling that strength in my lower body, and I'm able to breathe then into my hips and my lower body. And one way that I would describe it, just from my cue, is it's almost like the seated cat and cow that you were explaining earlier. So if someone does yoga, it's kind of breathing into the belly and then it's pulling back a little bit as well, which actually I find helps to open up the hips, especially the top of the back of the hips, the quadratus lumborum, which so many people have. It's just locked up. It's tight. They can't rotate. They can't move. And what I would say is to practice, meaning like a lot of the techniques here simply take practice. It's going back to, as you said, what you already know. But stop for 1 minute, meaning like you're at your desk, you're at your computer probably a lot during the day. Most people are. Just try to take 5 breaths, like 5 conscious aware breaths. And think about where that breath is going and how it's coming into your body. And then from there, we can take it to different levels, right? We could do Qigong-based breathing. We can do, yoga-based breathing, lion breathing, all of those. What would you say about that? Would you agree, disagree? How do you get people
Absolutely
to become more
perfect.
aware?
Exactly. And again, when you say things like breathe into there's a lot of, one of the reasons I got fascinated in this process is I was looking at words that confused us, but words that are comforting. So when you think about breathing into your back or breathing into your heart, it's a lovely idea, but most people will go, what does that mean? Or they'll nod yes, and then walk away and continue to breathe in a dysfunctional way. So being the child psychologist is I look to see what vocabulary was confusing us. Even if intellectually it made sense, what was, not really resonating with us physically. So I have to go back to why breathing, the mechanics of breathing has gotten popular, and give a shout out to, for instance, kettlebells, specifically jujitsu and yoga, along with stress that was not calming down no matter what we were doing, sort of joined all together and made breathing start to be breathing muscles, breathing mechanics be as important as it is now, and getting the attention that it's going to be getting, in the next few years, and hopefully keeping in the next few years. But really, if you do kettlebells, if you do martial art, specifically jujitsu, or if you come from a yoga background, and also the amount of stress that we have to deal with, all of a sudden people are thankfully looking to change their breathing. And when I say breathing muscles, it's because I separate respiration, which is more at a cellular level that has to do with your CO2, from breathing mechanics and breathing muscles. I tend to focus on breathing muscles, which is why I love looking at breathing in the gym. So how are you breathing to brace? How are you breathing for your precision sport? How are you breathing for endurance? But that's a whole nother topic. Going back to what you can do for your breathing is that making sure, if you had to do one thing, making sure your thoracic cavity is not a rib cage. So making sure the little muscles between your ribs move is the most important thing you can do. And back to your bucket analogy is that, yes, your hips go forwards and back much like a bucket, but if you actually think of the handles on the bucket, is that your ribs should move out. It's a small but incredibly important movement, is when you inhale, they should move out horizontally. And too often we talk about them moving up, and that's confusing. But the fact is your middle should be able to expand. So if I was to say there's one thing I want you to do, along with that conscious breath throughout the day, if you can bring yourself back to that breath, is make sure that when you inhale, you actually open up your sides and you think about those little muscles between your ribs, your intercostals actually stretching. So we can do this right now, where I want you to take your left arm and put it over your head so that your left bicep is on your left ear. And if you're seated, because I am, and most of us probably are, is that I want you to stretch your right hand down towards the floor, and then look up towards the ceiling, almost underneath your elbow, and stretch your left side open, but do that on the inhale. So go ahead and inhale and stretch that side open. And now you're breathing into your side. So inhale, stretch that arm, almost make your left fingers heavy and go towards the floor as you open up that side, look up towards the ceiling, and you'll feel that stretch on the inhale. Don't do it on the exhale. When you come up, almost grip the left side as if you're doing an exercise. So let's do that again, where your right hand is going down towards the floor. You're opening up your side. It's very much like a yoga stretch, but you can do it at your chair. Look up underneath your elbow and open up your side. So while you're doing this stretch, you can take your right hand and put it at your left side. And actually, if you take your fingers and put it underneath the last rib and your thumb underneath your armpit, as you inhale, you'll notice how much that space opens up. So you should find, as you inhale and stretch open to the right, opening up your left side, is that span between your fingers and your thumb on your left side gets wider. And that's exactly what I want. Because if you were to go into your body about an inch, you would find, ooh, there's my diaphragm. And then you go in a little bit further and you go, oh, those are my lungs. And that's actually the most dense oxygen rich part of your lungs right there where we're stretching. And then just because you need to be even, go ahead and go over to the other side and actually do that for me, where you take your thumb, put it at your armpit somewhere, put your ring finger and your pinky down at one of the lower ribs. And now inhale, stretch your ribs, lean over to the left, look up towards the ceiling, your elbows up towards the ceiling. And I want you to press your rib cage into your left hand and then give me a little bit of air packing. Inhale, gulp, press air into your right side. And now when you exhale with your muscles, pull your ribs together and come up. So that stretch, if I was to say, you're going to do one thing a day as far as your breathing, is keeping that part of your body stretchy, which with age naturally gets very tight, is going to be amazing for your breath. And now if you tip forwards and inhale, you'll realize, the breath is now moving from my belly to my sides. Which means that you can feel your belly inflate or you can feel it pop. And now you can feel your sides open up a little bit. On the exhale, narrow your whole body. So not just belly button to spines, but now your ribs as well. And that really is much more of a perfect breath than probably you were doing before. And although you still have work to do, it is a beautiful breath. It's giving you a lot more oxygen and calming you down.
Yeah, that's great. That's taking it to the next level right there, because then most people don't even know the amount of oxygen that they can actually draw in through a breath. That takes just a little bit of practice, or like you said, relearning, where you're breathing in first to the belly, but then you are expanding out. And I mean, I think that is something that will not only help, yes, it will help with your health, and we'll talk about that, your mental health, your physical health, it will help calm you down, but it makes people naturally more flexible. And I don't know if you've seen that in your practice, but we're doing a lot of stretching right now, but we're stretching, holding our breath, we're stretching, creating more tension, we're fighting against tension, where some of the most flexible people I've ever seen in my life do very little stretching, but they're very good at meditation, breathing, and just relaxation. Because if we look at the muscles as being innervated by the nervous system, and we look at our nervous system as being innervated by our breath, you can begin to understand that there's a flow here, that if we don't get the first part right, we can try to stretch through it all day, every day, but we're not going to become more flexible.
Exactly. And the calming, a lot of people are actually a little bit frightened about getting too calm, because they'll think, and I had to look at this, they'll think, well, if I get too calm, how am I going to be able to stay performing, and how am I going to be able to stay productive during the day? So I don't want to get too calm, or I don't want to actually realize how tired I am, because I won't be able to get everything done I have to get done. So the state you want might be one of being calm and alert. And that's amazing. That's actually where most people want to be, is they want to be productive. They want to be able to get as much done as they can during the day. But can you be calm and alert? Because being calm, it can be scary. Wow, if I get calm, I may go to sleep and stay asleep the whole entire weekend. So because we're so exhausted, that whole idea of calm is not something that is as attractive to someone as you can be calm, but you can still be alert enough to get the work done that you need to, and happy as well.
Yeah, and thank you for bringing that up too, because that is about cueing and the language that we try to use. When I talk about calm, I'm looking at it from the perspective of not running off anxious energy, of being calm, level, but like you said, alert. And one of the things that will change is when you do begin to just do something, honestly, as simple as getting more oxygen and retraining the body on how to breathe and getting more waste out, is that you'll have more oxygen to fuel your muscles and your brain. So you will be more alert. And that will allow you actually to be more productive. And the reason why it might not seem like that, because, you're amped up on caffeine or whatever it is, it's sustainable energy. What I look for now is different than I looked for maybe 10 years ago or 15 years ago, when I was deep into working with a lot of athletes and those types of people, is that I'm looking for what can you do right now for the next 30, 40 years at the same pace. Like, I want people who are passionate about their work and their family and travel, to be able to do that well into their 60s, 70s, and I would say 80s, just because I see too many people now that are in their 80s that are still going strong, and that's what I want for other people. So if we don't get the foundation right, and breathing is part of the foundation, so if we don't get the eating right, we don't get the movement right, that's different for each person. Sometimes it's a little bit more vigorous, sometimes it's a little lighter. And if we don't get that breathing right, I don't know that we're going to live the healthiest, strongest life that we can.
And like you said, the cueing for that, finding words that matter is so important. And I actually will throw this out as I was actually listening to your podcast about sleep. And you were talking about the rhythm is really tuning into the rhythm of when your body wants to go to sleep. And that was such an interesting moment for me. I travel a lot. So my sleep rhythm is something I don't pay attention to or I struggle with. And the way you described it, for whatever reason, made my brain turn a corner and be able to understand that and pay more attention to it and hence have more control over it. And that's what I'm hoping to do with the breath, is that you find the words that are getting in the way of you paying attention to it and you start caring about it, because all of a sudden the words, the mission, or the result is something that you can own and makes perfect sense to you personally.
Two things I would like is I want to be able to expand upon this topic that we've been talking about today, allow people to find more information from you. But as you were going through the exercise a little bit earlier about how can we expand the lateral part of our body and between our ribs, do you have a video on YouTube that we'd be able to link up to on the show notes page?
You know what? I will find you one, or I will make you one, specifically with that stretch. It is in the book, but it's very much a side stretch the way you would do any time. However, the breath is completely the opposite of what you've learned.
Exactly.
And the reason why, yes. And the reason, again, is that I let people know the reason that they're doing things. I don't just tell them, take a belly breath. For you to own your health and for you to, follow your protocol that's going to make you healthier, you have to understand why, and you deserve to have an explanation that has to do with your body and your life. And for me, when you inhale and stretch, what are you stretching? Why are you doing that stretch? And I want you to understand is that you have muscles between your ribs that are on the inside of your body. So you can't stretch them with a roller on the outside. You really have to use the breath to be able to stretch those muscles. And you're doing it. You're stretching your diaphragm. You're unlocking your diaphragm from its braced posture. You're opening up that side of your body with your breathing. So it's super practical. It's nothing about the universe or divine energy per se. It's really that you're mechanically adding air to your thoracic cavity. You're inhaling, and then you're stretching that part of your body. And you'll know you're doing it right because you're stretching on the inhale. And when you come up and you're done with that stretch, you'll say, oh my God, that felt so good. It's the simplest stretch, but once you change the breathing, it becomes completely different as far as what it's doing to your body.
I can't wait to try that. I'm heading to the gym in just about an hour from now, so I will let you know for sure how that goes. One more thing before we do wrap up. I want to be able to share with people the work that you're doing right now, what you're most passionate about, what your projects are, and then I'm going to share with them how to get your book as well. So what do you have going on that you want to share with us?
I love doing volunteer work, and I think it's something that as a clinician, I'm always telling my patients to do, is that the volunteer work I do really fuels me, as well as the research. So they're two completely different answers, but being able to work in different places where I give people back their breath or explain this so that they have it is terrifically important to me. And it's part of my mission and part of what I teach my students is that you have to do volunteer work. You have to be of service. You have to give back to the community. That's a responsibility that they have. So that's number one. The last place we did an amazing workshop was at a prison with lifers. So we actually did an amazing 3-hour meditation, and they were great. And the class itself was really tremendously satisfying and fantastic to see with a group of people that don't get enough attention, whether they are coming back into society when they finish the years that they have to spend there, or whether they're not able to. It's part of the society that we need to remember, even though they're not right in front of us, but we have a large number of our population that is in prison and going to be coming out, and we need to pay attention to that and them. The second part is research. Just putting together numbers and seeing change in a very, very practical way is fascinating to me, because with breathing, you always have people gesticulate in front of their body and wave their hands like, oh, yes, breathing. They usually sweep upwards when they breathe. And yes, the lungs and the heart and air and love and all kinds of wonderful things. However, you can measure a lot of these things. And to me, the last study that we did that we're putting together data and looking at pH and how pH changes, it can change within 90 minutes of you starting to breathe diaphragmatically. You can look at your breathing and see your pH, your body's pH change is fantastic. To be able to look at children and see at what age their breathing starts to change, which is another study we just finished about a month ago, and concretely see those numbers is completely fascinating to me. So right now, those are the two things that are really exciting. I'm sure they'll change within 6 months, and I'll have a few more as well, though.
Yeah, it's amazing. And, really for all the health practitioners, health coaches, for anyone in this natural health field listening to the show today, think about just what you're passionate about, what your niche might be in the health field. I mean, to me, when I found out about your work, I didn't know that it could go this deep into breathing. And actually, I'm someone who loves the research, so I can't wait for that research to come out on pH, because this will really begin to change a lot of people's viewpoints on how do we change pH? How do we change pH in the tissues and in the blood and, all different compartments of the body? So thank you so much for your work. It's absolutely incredible. I love that there are people out there willing to do all of this research so that each one of us can benefit from it. I know we could talk about this at length for much longer, but what I want to do is recommend everyone right now purchase your book, Breathe, the simple revolutionary 14-day program to improve your mental and physical health. And inside of that book, I read the book myself, and I've gone through it a couple of times now, there's a book on how you're breathing, also a quiz on stress. And I know that's something that we chatted about earlier as well. Two things that you're going to want to check out in the book. It's a fast read, well worth your time. And then hopefully, as I always say, if this information is helpful, share it with anyone else it could serve. Dr. Belisa, thank you so much for coming on the show today. And why don't you give one more plug for your website and Instagram on how we can find you?
Sure. Dr. Belisa at thebreathingclass.com is where you can find me, thebreathingclass.com. And Instagram, of course, is Dr. Belisa. And I answer emails and social media all the time. Thank you so much for having me. And thank you for your amazing, amazing work. It's been such an honor to be on your podcast.
Pleasure's all mine. Thank you. Take care, everyone, and we will chat tomorrow. Before you go, I wanted to share a personal story with you. The real reason I began to get well finally is because I figured out what was wrong with me. And that might seem pretty obvious, but I went from doctor to doctor for over 2 years before discovering at-home functional medicine lab testing. These are the labs that enabled me to finally figure out what was wrong with my hormones, blood sugar, electrolytes, and gut health. And once I knew what was wrong, I could then follow a proven plan in order to rebalance my body from the inside out. This is why I believe so strongly in functional medicine lab testing and why I've made it my mission to share these labs with the world. Now at equa.life, you can order an at-home lab test or lab bundle for you and your family and be able to complete it within the week. Plus, the EquaLife difference is that you're not left to try to read and figure out these labs on your own. We explain what your lab numbers mean, what they mean in the much bigger picture, and then how to go about rebalancing your body in order to heal. To see our full selection of lab tests, or to set up a free lab selection call to find out what labs may be best for you, simply head on over to equa.life/labs. And do remember, we ship these all over the world. To find out more and to set up your free lab selection call, simply head on over to equa.life/labs. That's EQUI.LIFE/labs.